Hi, everyone. Welcome to this concurrent session, and we're glad that you're all here. A little bit about what we're talking about today is as school systems continue to navigate uncertainty on a variety of fronts, the impacts of these changes will continue to be felt by students and staff. This workshop provides school staff an awareness of stress, trauma, and grief, their impacts on the students, teachers, and schools, as well as ways to effectively address them through the lens of recovery and renewal. And today we're lucky to have this Brianna Young as our speaker. She uses pronouns she and her and is a trauma-informed systems consultant with Trauma Transformed. That's the company, correct, Brianna?
Yeah.
Based in Oakland, California. After nearly a decade in public school system, she turned her focus to studying the impacts of trauma on individuals and systems and leverages her skills and experiences as an educator, curriculum designer, and administrator to support large and small organizations to define and implement actionable, trauma-informed change. She has worked with healthcare systems, county departments, community-based organizations, nonprofits, and school districts across the country, all emphasizing the importance of human and healing-centered cultural shifts. And I will turn it over to Brianna and let you go on with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. It's weird. It's still weird. It's always weird hearing someone read your resume off to you in front of a bunch of people.
I know, yeah. It is.
I'm okay, this makes me uncomfortable and I have to sit here and awkwardly smile while you're talking about me. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to share what will likely be a quick hour with all of you today, just to dive into a conversation I know is really buzzing around. A lot of these terms are showing up in our cultural zeitgeist. A lot of this language is being used throughout conversations, both socially and informally, like on social media and TikTok, through our school systems, through our healthcare systems and public health. So hopefully today we'll have some shared language. We'll be a little bit more connected to each other. And I want to make a point to support you as we go through this conversation. So I am, like I said, I'm just really, really glad to be here. So let me see if my slides are still going to move for me. Next. Did that work, Lori? Yes, sweet. Still figuring out this air meet thing. So, as Lori shared, I come from an organization called Trauma Transformed, and part of my work there is actually working with some SAMHSA grant-funded projects like the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project. We have a beautiful website that is filled with piles of resources. It's there on the screen for you, schoolcrisishealing.org. And our focus really is on the continuum of care. We want to really expand the capacity for schools and school-based staff to care for young people and the adults in the system during, after, and even years beyond a crisis happens in the school community. So that's a little bit about what we do. And of course, credits, we got to give a shout out to CARS. We got to give a shout out to SAMHSA and the Child Center for School Crisis Bereavement based out of LA Children's. Got to give homage to our roots. And so, hi, again, I'm Bree. She, her pronouns. I'm currently based in Oakland, California, even though right now I'm actually physically in Bethesda, Maryland, for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So leave it to an ambitious human to try and do 2 conferences in 1 week. That's what we're doing. But this one seems like the vibe. So I'm glad to be here with y'all. I love Frida Kahlo. I love eating at restaurants. I probably can't afford anything related to dogs is my love language. So if you have a little furry friend and you drop a picture of them in the chat, I will not be upset. And I'm also kind of a podcast junkie, and I love to watch and listen to podcasts and all those things. So I would love to know who's sharing space with me today. So if you're comfortable, please drop a hello in the chat. Obviously, your name is already attached, so you don't have to say that. But I'd love to know where you're coming from and a little bit about your role. Are you a school-based educator? Are you a therapist? Are you a social worker? What role do you hold in the system that you're in? So I'll give 30 seconds to kind of let that flow through the chat and do a little scan as that comes in. And we'll say hello to each other and feel a little more connected, hopefully. Yes. You have a chicken named Frida Kahlo. Fran, I love that. It's the best connection. That's amazing. Yes. All right. Some social workers, juvenile court. Excellent, excellent support, peer supports. Awesome. Alternative ed, Justin, I've worked in so many alternative education settings, and I feel like they're some of the most magical places in so many ways. Yes, welcome. Yes, it is afternoon, as East Coast time zone. Yes. Welcome, welcome. Yes, appreciating all of this insights. Oh my gosh, Joanna, not a Frida Kahlo podcast, y'all. My heroes already. See, I told you this was a good group. Thank you. Yes, from Florida. Awesome. Yeah, keep that coming in the chat, y'all. And feel free to click on somebody's name, send them a direct message, reply to them if someone's in your neighborhood you haven't met yet, or if someone's in a place you want to visit, professional virtual connections. We can make it happen. So again, thank you so much for being here. At a high level, here's our aims. We'll see if we can cover all of these things in an hour. But if I could summarize each of these aims, really our vision is to begin distinguishing both the parallels and overlap and the differences between stress, between trauma, between grief, between crisis, and just holding the tension that lingers between all of them, and especially how that shows up for young people in school systems. We're also going to pay intentional attention to the sociocultural conversation around that. So what's happening in our world, what's happening in our society, in our neighborhoods, that's impacting the ways our school communities can respond to stress and grief and trauma and crisis. And then hopefully we can start applying some stuff, specifically looking at this idea of crisis recovery and renewal. So what happens after the response, after the crisis counselors leave, after the additional supports and funding goes away? Now what? What do we do in our school community? So we're going to talk through that at a high level today. This is meant to be more of a 101 than it is to be a deep dive. So my hope is that if some of you on here are like, yeah, I know trauma-informed systems and practices really well, awesome. Then hopefully this feels like a refresher and you can weigh in your expertise throughout the conversation. Please, y'all, leverage the chat, come off mute, say some things, chat, discuss. I hope that this can be as interactive and collaborative as possible, as much as we can on this platform. And what you'll notice as I go through this conversation today, I'm going to try to toggle between different layers of a system, right? Because when we talk about stress, trauma, grief, and crisis, oftentimes, at least from my experience, the conversations I've been a part of have been very, hey, educators, hey, counselors, hey, support specialists. Trauma-informed practices are things you need to do to students. You have to fix something. Here's a practice. Here's a curricula. And the truth is, that's not all it is, right? We know this. We understand that trauma impacts our young people, but it impacts us as providers in sometimes different ways as well. It impacts the families, the community, and a lot of times the policies that our systems hold and move forward actually can be traumatizing and stress-inducing in and of itself. And so I'm going to try to toggle between all of these roles or these perspectives, from the students to the teacher to the classroom to support staff and the school system itself. And I also want to name, we're going to toggle between what I sometimes refer to as macro crises and micro crises. And we talk about this idea of a macro crises. These are the big events that impact the whole school community. That may be violence, a natural disaster, the death of a student. Those things are big macro crises. But also we know day to day, there's a lot of what we may perceive to be quote unquote small things that impact our students in significant ways. Many times our brain and bodies don't always know the difference between a big or small crisis, because that stress response is a stress response, whether it's big or small. And so these micro crises may be a peer-to-peer conflict or a family loss that is impacting one student significantly. And so they may not impact the whole system, but they still have a big impact on the life of the student. And so we're going to try to toggle between those lenses as well. And so what I want to start with in terms of content is really holding the principles of a trauma-informed system in front of our minds. And so I'm curious to know, in the chat, give me an emoji reaction. How many of you are familiar with the principles listed on the screen? Okay. you. Awesome. Cool. Okay. So I'm getting quite a few thumbs up. Anybody like, yo, Bree, this is like brand spanking new to me. I've never seen this, never heard of this before. Give me like a wave or a different emoji. Anyone like, I don't know what this is. Okay. Awesome. I love that. We love that. Thank you. And again, this is a part where the fact that we're all on a different spot in our learning journey is actually a gift. So those of you who feel like you are experts on this conversation, you know these principles well, as I'm explaining, feel free to drop in your insights or ahas in the chat as well to help expand the conversation. And if you're new to this conversation and I'm explaining something and you're like, yo, Bree, that doesn't make sense, or Bree, slow that down, let me know and we'll make a point to linger there. So I'll go quickly, a little high level over each of these, and hopefully my summary gives us enough of a shared understanding that we can move forward. So the first trauma-informed principle, and these are adapted from SAMHSA's trauma-informed systems principles, or principles of a trauma-informed school. And the first one is this lens of social justice. This is really critical for us to hold the context in which we operate at the front of our minds. There's a RISE Youth Center based out of Richmond, California, who's run by a brilliant woman named Conra Paul. And she loves to say regularly, we cannot be trauma informed unless we are racially just. And I think that's one beautiful picture or a phrase that really encapsulates the importance and necessity of social justice as a tenet for trauma-informed practices. And we'll dive a bit more into this a little bit later on. But I also think about ways in which the system itself oftentimes perpetuates harm and creates trauma for our young people, our families, and our communities. And by not attending to that, we aren't actually being trauma-informed. So having this justice-oriented lens is critical in the conversation. The next principle is collaboration, peer support, and mutuality. This is really about shared lived experiences. This is about saying, I've navigated challenges and traumas and crises too, and I've grown and I've moved forward, even if I haven't completely healed all parts of me yet. But let me lend my nervous system and my understanding of my experience to you, just as much as you lend that back to me. We're in a partnership together to build something together to overcome the crisis we're navigating. And that's really at the heart of collaboration, peer support, and mutuality. Then the next one is layered and complicated, but so important, is this idea of safety and stability. Another lens of this too sometimes is predictability. But safety is really important to think about because I think a lot of times we love to declare something a safe space, right? I go into a counselor's office or like they're in a session at a conference and someone's like, oh, this is a safe space. I'm like, is it though? Is it though for who? Who is safe in this safe space, right? And I think it's important for us to consider, we want to build things that help people feel safer, but safe isn't necessarily a destination. And what makes you feel safe may not make me feel safe, and vice versa. And I think that's important when we're thinking about policy, right? And I'll use an example of things like metal detectors when we walk into a school, right? Or a uniformed security guard. For some students, oh my gosh, I feel safe, that's clear, that's structured. For other kids, seeing an authority figure dressed in uniform and carrying a gun when they walk into a school setting can be really traumatizing and alarming. And so there isn't a universal understanding of this, which is part of why that collaboration and mutuality and support principle matters. So we're communicating and we're understanding each other so we can get closer to an understanding of safety. And this comes both from physical environment, social and emotional connections, and establishing this sense of well-being together is a really holistic lens on safety. The next one, trustworthiness and transparency. This is critical. I don't need to be the gatekeeper. I don't need to hoard the insights or secrets or knowledge or the experience or process. I can let you know what's coming. I can share with you what to expect. We can have a conversation about what next steps might be so that you feel like you have time to prepare yourself. So we can leverage safety. We can attend to justice, because if we're kind of keeping things close to the chest and not really sharing things out, that's really hard for folks, especially folks who are traumatized, to feel safe, or folks who've experienced trauma to feel like they can trust and move forward. Empowerment, voice, and choice is another really critical component and a key principle here. Trauma is something that violates our sense of control. It takes away our agency. It takes away any authority or autonomy we might have over ourselves. We feel helpless when we experience stress, grief, trauma, and crisis. And by giving that back to folks, giving them real and genuine opportunities to make choices for themselves, and not just fake choices, right? Like, oh yeah, you can pick, you can go to this clinic or that clinic. Okay, well, but if I only have access to this one clinic because it's affordable and I have access to transportation to this one because I can walk here, but I can't drive to this one, even though services might be better for me, I don't actually have a choice. There's only one option, right? And so thinking about how do we help people understand the implications of their choice, give them choices they can actually truly decide between, that can be empowering and lead folks closer to healing because they're getting that agency back that was taken away from them when they experienced trauma. And then the last principle is this idea of resilience, growth, and change. And this principle is multifaceted. It's about naming the strengths and capacities that exist in the communities that we're in already, right? Your culture, your identity, the relationships that you have, your religion, the pieces that matter most to you. Those are all protective factors to help you heal and be resilient against hardship and trauma. And so uplifting and celebrating those is important. It's this idea of moving forward without moving on. I've learned things from the trauma that I've experienced about myself, about my community, about what I can and can't withstand. And learning those things can be a powerful leverage point for moving forward. And even more than that, it may inspire me to take action and be invested and involved in my community. And so I'm curious, I just kind of dumped like all of these on you really quick and at a really high level. I'd love to just pause here for a moment and just check in the chat, or if someone, now, Lori, they can come off mute, right, on the platform? Is that a thing? Or no? Is it just the chat? Maybe not. Okay, no worries. My invitation to you, let me know which one of these principles is landing for you. Or if you have a question on any of them, feel free to drop it in the Q&A. Perfect. And I'm seeing a few questions come through. So in the chat, just let me know which of these principles is landing for you, feels meaningful or relevant to your work right now. Or if there's a question about one of these principles, feel free to drop it for me.
So there, Brianna, there was a question in the Q&A.
I do see that.
And I'm going to show it on the stage so everybody can see it because it's long. So how can we help schools to look at children through a trauma lens, looking at reasons for difficulties or behaviors and potential supports to help them and their family instead of just responding or punishing a child based on what they did?
Yes. And this is such a good question. And I will dive into, I think, more layers of this a little bit further in the presentation, but I don't want to leave this untouched now. And so I think at a high level, the fact that you're asking the question of saying, might trauma potentially be at the root of this behavior? Because what I'll say, regardless of what that answer is, at the end of the day, if we hold the fact that this child may be acting out of self-defense, self-preservation, this perception of this is what I'm needing to do to keep myself safe. This is what I'm needing to do to help me feel like I belong, I'm connected. This is what I need to do to help me feel like I have some control over my environment again. That shifts our focus significantly. So part of that sometimes just looks like asking our colleagues, hey, what might be going on for that child? Why do you think they made that choice? And if you'll notice right away, do they say a value statement or are they paying attention to like a circumstance or context, right? Because I think a lot of times when we see a behavior in a student, we believe that that's a character quality, right? Well, that's your character. You're lazy. You're rude. That child's disrespectful. And a lot of times it's like, no, that child feels unsafe. That child was startled. That child was embarrassed. And so if we can get in the habit of just collectively when we sit together, and like we can do this structurally, we can have meetings as teams where we sit and say, okay, who are some students? I used to do this with my 8th grade when I led my 8th grade team. Who are some students that are like stressing us out this week? What's going on with them? Let's get curious and say, okay, like this child's been showing more behaviors lately. What might be going on for them? Who do we need to contact? Let's make a phone call to mom or let's call uncle and just see what's going on so we can get better context and understand. So it is a collective conversation, yes, but a lot of it is the mindset shifts that we need to take as adults. And some of that is modeling that ourselves, helping our colleagues ask critical questions, and then expanding and getting a shared understanding about that across our team. So there's definitely some books that I can pull up and put links for to at the end of the session that you could potentially read with your colleagues to help build shared understanding, have conversations like this with them. But yeah, at a high level, it really is a lot of adult mindset shifts for sure. Yeah. And I love that there's some other colleagues who are dropping some reflections in the chat. Yes. Yes. And I'm seeing some themes in the chat emerging too of this idea, like all of these principles intersect and overlap. And that's the truth, right? Like we need all of these things together to actually be a fully effective trauma-informed system. So as I keep going, and again, I know this was a high level view of these principles, but look for them throughout the rest of the conversation, because I'm going to dive a little bit deeper now into stress, trauma, grief, crisis conversation. And I'll invite you to keep your eye out and see where social justice comes back in, see where empowerment, voice and choice, or resilience and safety come back into the conversation, because they're not gone. They're going to keep coming back in. So I want to explore now this idea of stress. And when we think about this idea of stress, really what ends up happening is we can either navigate the stress or we struggle to navigate the stress, because not all stress is bad, right? Deadlines. I'm under a little bit of stress right now because I got lights on me and I'm talking to a bunch of people I've never met before and can't even see. Like there's a layer of stress that's good and helpful, but it's good and helpful to motivate us, to give us energy when it's regulated, when we feel like we actually have resources that can support us. And so when our perceived resources match, right, our perceived stressor, this is a challenge we can overcome. Okay, I've got the tools internally and externally that I can navigate this. I've got this. But at times, our perceived resources are actually far below the perceived stressor. And when that happens, we feel helpless, we feel overwhelmed, we feel like we can't actually navigate this thing that's in front of us. And much like safety, this is relative, right? There are some things that may be really manageable challenges for me that may be overwhelming threats for someone else, and vice versa. And what's critical to attend to is this idea of perceived, right? If I perceive it to be overwhelming and I perceive that I do not have resources, then it is overwhelming and I don't have resources, even if they're right in front of me. And I know many of you who work in community-based organizations, right? Like, I'm sure you run into this idea all the time of like, why aren't people taking advantage of our services? Like, I've been on grant projects where we'd have to give money back because we couldn't spend on the money because people weren't using it. And it's like, no, it's happening. Why? But people aren't always aware that the resources are there for them, or it's maybe not in their language, or they don't have transportation to them. And so these things then stem over into becoming an overwhelming threat. An analogy I use for this is a divorce, right? Again, teaching 8th grade, I had one student whose parents got divorced and he was like ready for it. He was like, had resources, had support networks, had been seeing the counselor because his parents were fighting all the time. And he was like, finally, peace in the home. Like, I don't have to deal with this anymore. That was a manageable challenge for him because he had the tools he needed to overcome this really stressful thing in his life. And another student, I think the next year, whose parents got divorced, and he was completely blindsided. Like, he had no clue it was coming. He had never been to a counselor. He didn't, like, his friends didn't have any, like, he didn't have any friends whose parents were divorced. He had no clue how to navigate it. And his academic performance tanked. He stopped being engaged as much in the classroom. And it's like, man, like the same, literally, quote unquote, the same thing had drastically different outcomes for both students. And so it's something for us to think about too, when we sometimes see things like, well, why is that a big deal to you? Why does that matter to you? Because we sometimes, right, as adults, we forget that like our brains are now fully developed and, we have more coping tools than we did when we were younger. And so just reminding ourselves that, hey, this student may not know the supports they have and they may need a little bit more time, or they may need a little bit more care in order to navigate and overcome this. So that's a high level look at a concept of stress. And I want to pull us to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's definition of trauma through the lens of the 3 E's. And when we talk about this, event is an actual danger or extreme threat of harm. And this can be experienced directly or indirectly. And so if there's an attack on, I think about this a lot when there was a shooting incident at a school in another state. And I remember the feeling of like being in a lockdown in my own school setting, and the fear of that and the empathy of that, of someone in my own community, another educator, right, is at risk. Like I wasn't actively threatened, but I felt in my body some of those same stress responses, right? My heart rate, my stomach hurt, my shoulders carried tension because of that indirect threat of like, oh my gosh, this could be me, right? So an event is that idea of the experience of the thing that happens. Then our experience is what's happening within us in that event. So we oftentimes enter fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode, and I'll go into those a little bit more in detail in a moment. But at the end of the day, our experience oftentimes is that we feel helpless to escape. And what that happens is that overwhelms our brains and bodies. We begin to not have as much connectedness to ourselves, and that leads to an effect. We become disintegrated. Our brains and our body that normally work together and in sync kind of don't anymore. Different parts of our neurological system begin to slow down. Our breathing is harder. Our heart rate is faster. And over time, that can have a long-lasting and lingering impact. And on the flip side of this too, right? Like when we talk about this, there are also other protective and resiliency factors that come into place. And we have supportive and caring relationships, when we have tools and resources at our disposal, when we have navigated experiences that have been positive and healing and wholesome for us earlier on, that creates a bit more resiliency factors for us in navigating big events and big crises. And if we're in situations where we continually experience trauma, crises, those things actually compound and build on each other. And one study projected that even potentially up to 20 years off of someone's lifespan if they're continually in a crisis state, which is a pretty overwhelming statistic. And then layering into this next conversation is this idea of grief. And what's interesting about grief is that not all grief has a root in trauma, but all trauma carries some layer of grief within it. And grief really comes out of a loss, right? When we lose something. This may be the death of a meaningful person, but not always, right? It can sometimes be a ritual, routine, a habit that changes. When we have life transitions, good or bad, we can sometimes grieve, right? What was, even if we're moving on to something we want or excited about. And like also to the perceptions and feelings that we may feel. And I think really clearly, a collective case study in a way for this idea of grief is actually COVID. And I think a lot of folks talked about the lens of COVID as being a collective trauma, which I don't necessarily disagree with. But I might challenge that actually a lot of what we struggled to put our fingers on during the pandemic time in the heat when we were all in quarantine and there was, constant negative discourse and disagreement about everything. Like we lost a way of being, especially those of us who interacted regularly with young people. We weren't face to face. We weren't connected with them. The community and our way of doing that was lost. And yes, we talked about that as being stressful and being traumatic. But I think there was a piece of grief that we also didn't really get to name of like, I miss that. Like, I really, really miss that. And it hasn't yet become what it was and probably never will in the same way. And there's worth making space for that. It's worth naming that for ourselves and saying, okay, like this isn't going to be what it was. And I'm going to make peace with that. And I'm going to make something new from this. But it's okay that I feel mad about that. It's okay that I'm sad. It's okay that I'm tired. Those pieces, validating that experience for ourselves is important. And that's the layer of grief. And I think in light of these, again, high level, quick explanations of stress, trauma, and grief, this kind of brings me back to a point I was mentioning in answering that question that came up earlier of like, how do we actually do this thing in schools? What does this mean? How do we help adults shift? And a huge part of this, like was talked about, is this idea of mindset or perspective shift. And our default oftentimes is that judgment, is that character statement, is that what's wrong with this kid, right? Oh my God, what's wrong with that teacher down the hall? What's wrong with this school? What's wrong with this district? What's wrong with my supervisor? What's wrong with me? Like that's often our lens when we're frustrated or don't understand something. We go like, what's wrong with this thing? But if we can shift our focus to curiosity over condemnation, right? And instead of saying it as a character judgment, but we see it as a context or a condition issue, being able to say what's happening, what is being communicated here, what need is yet unmet in this person, If I can get more at the root of that, that's going to better help me respond in a trauma-informed way and not resort, like the question asked earlier, to discipline or punishment or consequence. But instead, it's solution focused. It's curious about strengths and capacities of that individual in order to move towards healing. Any questions or comments on what's been shared so far? Because I'm going to dive into another thing that in a moment that I know is going to generate a lot of dialogue because y'all a chatty group and I'm here for it. Any questions or comments?
I'm not seeing any in
Me
the
neither.
chat or on Q&A, so I think you're good.
Awesome. Okay. And again, y'all too, feel free, any reactions, needs in the chat, let me know. I'm appreciating all the reaction buttons. That's really helpful for me to know folks are tracking, and don't hesitate to dive in and ask questions as needed. So I mentioned earlier when I was talking about trauma that I would dive a bit more into fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And I want to frame this actually, again, this question, it's like I paid. Let me see, who is that? Who asked that question? Let me pull up. Alicia asked that question. It's like Alicia was a plant, let me tell you, because this sets this conversation up really well. Because a lot of times when we're in a school, right, and we see young people with behaviors, we put a label on it. You're ADD, you're oppositional defiant, you have some other behavior disorder, academic learning disability, whatever. And we actually miss the fact that some of these behaviors are actually rooted in survival. And what's bonkers about this is a lot of these are actually biological responses that our brain is predicting something is going to be a threat, something is going to make me unsafe. And so my body is reacting sometimes before the interaction is even complete. And at the end of the day, when I am seeking to protect myself, that survival point of my brain is on focus and my intellectual, logical capacity is reduced, especially in young people, really anyone under 25, right? Whose brain is not yet fully developed. And honestly, frankly, even mine, because let's be real, I'm absolutely represented on this slide as well. It's this idea of these responses are punished differently in the school system, and they shouldn't be. So let's break them down. So we go into fight, right? This fight response, I think, shows itself in a few ways. We see this in verbal and physical intensity. I think about like the tiny little lizard that like rears up on its hind legs to try and look big when a predator's coming. Like that's what our babies are doing when they're in fight. They just try to make themselves look bigger so they feel safe and they feel like the threat or the stressor goes away. And yes, adults, sometimes we have to own that whether we intend to be or not, we are the stressors for the children. Even if it means we're just asking you to do your math homework, that may feel like a stressor for them, right? And so it's about being patient, understanding why that's stressful so we can move forward and support them. But what we see sometimes in the school system is when our young people are displaying fight behaviors, often intended to protect them, whether we perceive they need to be protected or not, they feel that way, is labeled the bully or they're the non-compliant student. And so by thinking differently about kid always asking, well, why do we have to do this? Why are we doing that? As a kid who's actually just kind of trying to be a little tougher so they feel safer. Okay, that's going to frame how I respond to that child. Or if you're suddenly like start yelling at me when you get a problem wrong, well, maybe you're just embarrassed and you're just trying to save face and that feels scary to you. So like you feel like you don't belong now because you made a mistake. And so you're trying to restore that need of belonging by being hostile to the adult to get attention from the peers. And so, okay, I can mitigate that. We can take a breath. We can slow down. And other ways too, that fight response oftentimes has deep roots in a care for other people, a protective instinct. It has care in this way of being vocal and an advocate. And so beginning to leverage some of those things as strengths too is another strategic move. Like, oh my gosh, I see that you're so passionate about this. It seems like you need something. What can I get for you? Right? Just reframing can be really helpful. The flight response is interesting because I think at times when I think about a flight response, right, I think about a kiddo eloping, right? Like I'm like, okay, I gotta get out. I gotta get away. I'm going to leave the class. I'm going to run away. But at times, flight actually is, I escape into academic performance. I escape into perfectionism. And so think about this. For some of our young kiddos who are high academic achievers, who are really into their schoolwork, who are really passionate about something, that's all they can talk about, that may actually be a survival response. They're escaping from things that are hard or that they don't want to deal with or they don't want to navigate into something else. That's still a flight response. And how elopement is consequenced in the school system, whereas academic perfectionism is often elevated and celebrated. There's a tension there. That's hard to navigate. And so toggling between, okay, what might this behavior be? What might be at the root of this may help me better support that child, whether I appreciate their behavior or not, right? Then freeze response, right, is this idea of someone who might be disengaged, a dropout. It's a numbness. It's a general numbness. And I think what's helpful to understand when we talk about these responses is actually knowing what yours is and where you identify. Because if you know what your default response and reaction might be when you're stressed, when you're overwhelmed, that can actually help you understand how to better navigate what you experience with young people. And I'll explain that more through a story. Had a student in one of my classes who always would have his head down. He was going through a lot at home, and I knew that. I knew he was going through a lot. And he just wasn't engaged ever, head down all the time. And I just be like, hey, Bryce, buddy, come on, talk to me. Like, come on, let's talk, let's chat. Like, what's going on? Whatever. And he just looked at me and put his head back down and looked at me. I'm like, I'm offering him to talk. I want to sit with him. I want to be with this way, da, 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 da. And my colleague was like, yeah, but Bree, like, your response is fight. Like, when you feel stressed, you want to talk it out. He like doesn't have the capacity to do that. Like, just sit with him. Because she's a freeze responder. She named that she would be a freezer. She's like, I just need someone to sit with me until I can make sense of it all and I feel safe to share. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm trying to get this kid into my trauma response because I know how to navigate that better. Where in fact, it was just stressing him out more. And so knowing us and knowing where we're at and where we're at is important. And yeah, Camila, I see your comment, and Fawn is going to build into this as well too, because Fawn response is newer in emerging, in understanding, but it's certainly not newer in experience. And it's this idea of being the people pleaser, not being able to say no, being the teacher's pet. And these are students who oftentimes will really fly under the radar because they want to make everyone around them feel comfortable and safe, because when everyone else around them feels comfortable and safe, that's how they stay safe, right? Another way to say this is fawn. Sometimes people say appease as well, right? I'm gonna go with what you want, whatever you want. Of course, I'll accommodate. No problems here. I'm not a threat. Don't look at me. I'm not a problem. And a lot of times those kiddos, very similarly, they always want to help. They're so eager to partner. They never say no. They're never defiant. They're always ready to engage. Again, another practice that's really normalized and celebrated in the school system. But if we see a student who's constantly teacher's petting, constantly helping, constantly wanting that attention, oh my gosh, there may be something else actually underneath that. Like, hey, how come you're helping me out so much? Or how come you're always like asking me these questions and trying to stay after school? I know it's not because you like me. I'm not that cool. Like, help me understand what's going on, right? So again, what does the school system penalize and what does it celebrate? Yeah. And Dave, your comment you put in the chat is reminding me a little bit of that. What is that phrase? Like hurt people, right? And I think it's this idea of when we are in an environment and we're in an experience. And I think too, like this is part of the conversation of why we also need to speak out against some of the colonialistic white supremacist structures that exist in our world, because what we are conditioned and normalized into being, the boxes that we are funneled through, can be really complicated to overcome. And having conversations with folks even this morning about violence prevention and what does that look like to do that realistically in communities. And also while naming that for some of our young people, violence is the way that they stay safe. They look tough. That keeps them safe in their neighborhood community. And then they're punished for it at school. So how do we live in this both and right now where we're trying to build a better world for them, but also knowing they still need to survive in the world that we have, right? And that's a really messy and tricky spot to be in. And so, yes, sometimes young people, it goes back to ultimately, I think, Dave, to your comment, that idea I mentioned on the trauma-informed system slide of this idea of they need belonging, they need safety, and they need agency. And sometimes bullying can bring kids community. Sometimes bullying helps them feel safer. And sometimes bullying gives them back a sense of control. And so if we can provide kids with one of those three things in a different outlet, it can be a really good mitigator for some of the bullying conversations. Yes. And bullying, absolutely, Leah, can happen by adults when we ourselves are not regulated. And that's the invitation to think about, again, which of these things is yours? Do you just shut down and let the class like go crazy when you're tired, or your therapy group, just chill and do nothing because you're just freezing because you're so stressed? Do you bend over backwards to make sure kids like you and your peers like you? You might be fawning actually in that stressful situation. You always got something to say. You got a quick feisty email. Those may be pieces as well that are surfacing within yourself. So being attentive to that is helpful. Yes, awesome. Beverly, I see your comment. Become trauma-informed and hold spaces for support meetings. Awesome. Thank you for that, Beverly. And I do, again, just want to nudge, beyond nudge, really, is just really uplift, importantly, the intersection that we run into as well. When we talk about all of these pieces of these trauma responses and the harms that befall our young people sometimes in the systems that are intended to help and heal them, they don't occur in isolation, right? And so that middle there, a traumatic event, certain events can happen to anyone at any time, right? Any of us could fall victim to a natural disaster at any moment, right? But we also then experience that in the societal and contextual bubble. And so when we talk about this idea of, okay, racism, sexism, classism, xeno, homophobia, all those pieces, those things in and of themselves are traumatic to experience, right? Racism is a trauma. Homophobia is a trauma. And that trauma in and of itself limits access and validation to resources and tools that might help someone heal from other traumas. And so what happens is we have this really toxic, synergistic conversation around barriers to access to care for folks who are impacted by multiple systemic challenges. And even initially, there's the ACEs study, I'm sure some of you are familiar with that, is this idea of those traumas and studies, but it was done in a predominantly suburban, middle-class, white context. And so when they then took it to Philadelphia and they did some more research and they're like, hey, there's actually other things that happen in our communities. Because like we were seeing trauma happen in some young people who like had really healthy home situations and hadn't experienced anything that was that painful. And we're like, whoa, what's going on, right? But noticing there are things that were happening, community violence or experiencing racism or discrimination based off of one of your identities. That's a trauma. And so naming that and being clear about that is so, so important because the traumatic events aren't happening in a vacuum. They're within the context of our lives and naming so clearly, right, that the identities that are oppressed are not the problem, right? Someone is not experiencing more trauma because of their identity. The way that the systems around us are responding to those traumas, right? The way that the systems are responding to those traumas and not supporting individuals and allowing them to be their full selves is what the problem and the challenge is. Tammy, I'm seeing your question. Which is the most healthy response? Are you referencing the previous slide with the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn? Perhaps I'm thinking because that was 3 minutes ago, probably. So I think what's complicated is the word healthy and how to address that in a way that makes sense. So let me say it this way. I think at the end of the day, any response to trauma is an adaptation, right? And I think the way in which sometimes we do things leads to certain outcomes and other actions, like we talked about, right? Fawn tends to lead to more positive actions and support in the school system, whereas fight responses may tend to lead to negative responses. And at the end of the day, though, those are survival responses that our young people, and frankly us, use to engage in our world. And so to a certain extent, like they're all healthy because in the moment they're helping you cope and navigate and move forward. Yet really none of them are healthy because you're not actually like sitting and processing and allowing things to move through you and around you in a way that maybe won't lead to like reactionary consequences. And so I think, Tammy, what I will say is when we think about the most healthy trauma responses, the healthy trauma responses are responses that can be held in community by others. They're responses that we can like make space for and listen to and really hold our young people in. So it's not even so much that a young undeveloped brain is gonna respond in a healthy way. It's that, okay, when they respond, does the community around them respond to that in a healthy way? right? And that looks like meeting the child where they're at. That looks like sitting with them and listening to them. That looks like being patient, allowing them space to feel without causing harm to someone else or themselves. And really being able to say like, hey, buddy, like, I noticed you dropped a whole lot of curse words there. What's going on? What do you need? Or like, dude, you haven't been in school in 3 weeks. Like, I missed you. Where have you been? Come on in, please. Like, let's catch up. I miss you. How are you doing? Did you watch that new episode last night? Like, ways in which we react to our young people is really good. What's going to help them have more healthy responses. And then, of course, there's tools and evidence-based practices where we can teach young people healthier coping mechanisms, right? It's like when you're overwhelmed, how do you identify your triggers? How do you take deep breaths to kind of move and heal through those pieces, right? Journaling, having conversations with somebody, screaming into a pillow, punching a pillow, those things, like we can give them safer, right, coping strategies so they can, a more socially accepted coping strategies perhaps. But at the end of the day, regardless of how they respond, it's important for us to be responsive and caring and patient with them. And Tammy, feel free to add more to that question if there's more clarity or explanation you want on that. And some of that may surface kind of as we keep sharing. So I do want to, I was going to have a quick little conversation about this. And I am curious, I do kind of want your lens, and I've talked again a lot at you for a while, but I would love to know in the chat, if you can, just a quick check-in. We got about 15 minutes left in the session. What's coming up for you when you think about trauma responses, when you think about the lens on sociocultural trauma and how the isms and phobias exacerbate ways people are attempting to heal from trauma? We think about what's normalized and what isn't normalized in our school communities. I'd love to know in the chat. Feel free to ignore the questions on the slide. Like, what's coming up for you right now? What are you thinking about? Any ahas you're having at this point? And I'll give a 30 seconds or so for folks to chime in the chat. Yeah, Sarah, exactly. Our responses model what resilience might look like, 100%. That'll help them with the bounce back and the growth. Yes, Karen, generational trauma. Getting at that comment earlier about some of the modeling that we see, right? And bullied kids also may become bullies. How do we in turn? And I think too, that's part of those of you who are my family support specialists on the call, my community-based folks, that family wraparound care is so critical and so important to helping our young people thrive, 100%. Ooh, yes. Ciara, that comment about lashing out, it seems like they're instigating that conflict, but like, if all I'm known is conflict, that feels safer. That's familiar to me. If I'm used to that conflict and that battle and that hustle and tussle, like I may create that because that's what I know how to navigate in. So that's a whole other, right? We have to do teaching and patience and teaching. Absolutely. Yes. Truancy sometimes feels safer, right? Because I don't always know how to be in school. School doesn't feel like it sees me sometimes. Fight as a defense mechanism. Yes. Thank you for that, Justin. Absolutely. And I think, again, y'all, I just want to reemphasize that point of this idea of safety, agency, and belonging as being things that are disrupted when our young people experience trauma, and restoring or giving them back some safety, some agency, and creating a culture of belonging are going to be critical strategies for us as support staff and school leaders when we think about how to support young people through traumatic experiences in our school system. Yes. Yes, Joanna. And I think too, like the tension here of this, because yes, there is work we as adults have to do because we control the system in many ways, right? And I think oftentimes it turns into a policy of I need to do this to kids. This is rules I need to do and blah, blah, blah. But really, this is a culture and a mindset and an attitude shift. Because if we, in turn, begin to understand, okay, some of what we're punishing may actually be survival strategies. That means our policies and our system have to change. We have to rewrite our discipline hierarchy. And a book that I would highly recommend for y'all is a book by Dr. Lori DeSaltis, and it's called Connections Over Compliance. It talks a lot about the neurobiology of what's happening when we're stressed out and how our nervous systems get activated, and how if we focus on connection and regulation, that's actually a lot more powerful for our young people. Mm-hmm. Yes. And Leah, thank you for naming that in the conversation too. Different states have policies and systemic and political decisions that are happening that are making it really hard to do what we know to be the right work. And that's really, really painful. Yeah. And I think y'all I'm not going to get too political, but I am, because everything that matters is political. But what I want to say is vote, y'all. Get people out there, get people voting. Local elections matter. Local elections matter for sure. But yes, I've taught in a lot of states where that's been a problem and it's been a challenge. And yeah, just naming that tension and what it means to do the right work in different ways. Yeah. Oh yeah, Karen, absolutely. The mental health conversation and how that looks. Absolutely. We perpetuate the stigma so much more than we realize. Yes. And I want to challenge you too. Remember that slide where it was like the what's wrong with versus like, okay, what are other questions we can ask? Don't what's wrong with yourself. Don't forget that as you are reflecting and doing the deep internal work that we all have to do, because we all have to do that, don't get into judgment and blame mode with yourself. Like, whoa, shoot, okay, you know what? I did not make a good choice. I look back on baby first year teacher Bree, and she made a lot of mistakes. She caused a lot of harm. She messed up a lot of things. And I want to work to make that right, both in the work that I do and in how I repair relationships with those young people. And I can't hate myself for that. I can't. What good is that going to do? I can be disappointed. I can be hurt. But like at the end of the day, it's about deep self-reflection that's going to lead to change and doing better in the future, and then repairing maybe what we need to from the past. Great questions, great comments, y'all. Thank you for this. Thank you for this. I want to frame for us really quickly the bridge towards healing. And the project I work on, the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project, talks a lot about the 4 R's of crisis and crisis response in this continuum. We move through this idea of readiness. It's the preparation, it's the training, it's the policy we write so we're ready for a crisis. And then the big thing happens. The thing we were hoping wouldn't happen happens. So what do we do? So there's the response. Immediate safety needs, right? Communication practices, getting resources, on the ground support, crisis counselors, like the first week, the days and maybe week after that crisis, the big thing happens. That's that response phase. And then they leave. And then what? Then what do we do? That's when we begin to enter what we call recovery and renewal. And recovery is really that reintegration, that stabilization, that idea of, okay, I'm orienting now. I just did a cannonball in the deep end of the pool and I'm coming up and trying to get my bearings. Like that's that recovery phase. I'm beginning to see the edge of the pool and I can start swimming to it, right? And then this renewal piece is this longer term effect and really meaning making and recommitment to my community, to the work, and to the world that I'm in. Yeah. And so what I like to do is reflect when we think about, okay, if I want to begin to move closer to healing, if I want to move towards this idea of recovery, I'm no longer responding to this crisis, right? I'm beginning to start thinking and making sense of it. It's important for us to reflect and say, okay, how do we know we're doing this? So like, is my nervous system still really activated? Is my breath still shallow? Is my heart rate really high? Like, I'm not telling a narrative right now. I'm not able to make sense of things or make decisions. I need to just get my nervous system in check. Then I can move forward, right? Am I still like trying to get, kids out of the hallway and back to class? Am I still trying to get food and resources to people who need it? Like my immediate safety needs might not be met yet. So I'm probably still in the response. So it's not time to debrief. It's not time to start debriefing yet, right? Am I able to reflect? Am I feeling a bit more safe? How am I feeling about the people around me? Is trust beginning to be reestablished? Are we settled in? And how we answer these questions will determine if we're able to step into this phase of recovery and then into renewal, or if we're still kind of responding and need to get ourselves together through breathing, other strategies. And I have only a few more slides because we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to make sure I leave space for other questions or comments at the end. So I'll take about a couple more minutes to just finish sharing content, and then we'll pause for questions. So when we talk about recovery, we see the surface in 3 ways. First is that stabilization. It's about saying, okay, where are we? What do we need? Right? What's happening for us? And not just physical safety, but are you feeling emotionally safe again? Do you feel like you can trust people? Do you feel like you can talk to people? Do you feel socially safe? How are you attending to care and connectedness to those around you? Another piece is after a big crisis, sometimes even a small crisis, we got to remember and mourn. We got to process. I like to think about this as a space where we hold space for someone without trying to fix it or improve it. We're just listening. This is a key piece, I think, in restorative practices. If folks are familiar with restorative justice practices, we sit, we listen to each other. I hear and validate your experience. You hear and validate mine. Great. Step one, right? That's how we move through that together. And then step 3 is really a reconnection. Okay, I've navigated this crisis or this trauma or this big thing. Now, who am I? I've learned something about me, right? I just had a conflict with a peer, or I just navigated a natural disaster and I saw my community come together in cool new ways. That's amazing. How do I want to embody that in the future? I lost this person. What pieces of who they are do I want to make part of who I am now? How might my work begin to define and shape what I do? And that bridges us into this space of renewal and this idea of moving towards meaning making, healing, and change. So we begin to, after we survive something, a key piece of healing is storytelling, about sitting with folks and having conversations, building a shared narrative, prioritizing folks' proximity to the experience, right? This was like your really close best friend that you lost. We want to learn alongside you and care for you and support you. Or maybe if we are thinking about, oh my gosh, like many of you probably came into the work that you do right now because of something that happened in your past. You had an adult who cared for you. You had a really complicated and rough schooling experience, and you wanted to make that better for young people. You saw harms in your community that you weren't able to have agency over as a child. So now you're saying, no, I want to make a difference for people here, right? And I think that's the gift that we can all give to each other, is as we begin to process all of the complexities and challenges and behaviors that we see young people navigating. What does it look like for us to begin to move forward together, to sit with students and build a collective shared narrative that changes and shifts the way systems respond to behaviors and respond to young people in light of all of these things that we're navigating together? And so I'm going to stop sharing right now because we have about 3 minutes and I want to be conscious and honor y'all's time. I'm loving the quote sharing. I'm a sucker for a good quote. So I'm grateful for like dropping this in the chat because this is golden. And I'll read it in case you didn't catch what Dave shared in the chat. It said, in order to love who you are, you can't hate the experiences that shaped you. And good crowdsourcing said that's a quote from Andrea Dykstra. So I think that's a beautiful note. Truly appreciating all of you. We have 3 minutes. I didn't see any other questions come through the Q&A portion, but if you have things that are pressing on your mind, you're thinking about, or comments you want to leave, reactions to things, disagreements, pushbacks, cries of outrage, whatever, I'm here for it all. So we got 2 minutes left together. So feel free to let me know anything that's landing for you or ask a question. Thanks, Lori.
Sure. One of the things in the chat that I saw was the difference in resources that are available to kids and families in the rural areas. Any thought about that? Or
Yeah, and that's complicated, right? Because we know that stress and trauma and crisis and grief hit rural areas just as hard as they do urban areas and suburban areas, right? So I think a few hubs can be helpful in rural areas, looking at like county offices of education, looking at county level services can be helpful because a lot of funding goes into that for rural communities. I also think truly like leveraging the internet. And that feels hard, but our young people are constantly seeking out community through TikTok, through social media, through all of these ways. And so how might we, in a way, coach their algorithm to like, hey, search some mindfulness, lean it, like talk to their phone, take it like, hey, mindfulness, they listen to us anyway, right? Just like whisper like that idea. But I do know there's a lot of SAMHSA grants and other things that are infusing a lot more attention into the rural communities. I'm happy to do, I don't know what post-conference communication looks like. I don't have anything queued up right now, but I'm happy to look. I know there's like a rural, what's it called? It's like a rural mental health collaborative coalition. Google something like that and something will come up that can support that. But definitely look at your county or statewide agencies, and just search like rural mental health, SAMHSA, rural mental health, and you'll be able to find some resources. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brianna, for all of your great information and being so helpful. And I really am impressed with our participants as well, with all of the help that they've given each other in the chat. It was fun to watch that. So thank you very much. And remember that it's a 30-minute break now, and then there will be the closing keynote at the bottom of the hour. Wherever you are, it's the bottom of the hour. Okay, have a great day, and thanks, Brianna. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.